Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris. I'm genuinely excited about today's story because it sits right at the strange intersection of rockets, raw compute, and the economics of open source artificial intelligence.
So let's set the table for everyone listening, because the headline alone made me do a double take when it crossed my screen yesterday morning. What exactly happened here?
Here's the short version, and it is wild. SpaceX, the rocket company, just signed a computing power deal worth up to $6.3 billion with an open source startup called Reflection AI.
Okay, wait. When you say SpaceX signed a compute deal, my brain immediately wants to ask why a launch company is suddenly in the business of renting out graphics processors to an AI lab.
That is exactly the right question to sit with, and it is the whole reason this story matters far beyond one contract. SpaceX, through Elon Musk's orbit of companies, has access to a massive data center called Colossus 2.
And Colossus 2, for people who have not been following the infrastructure arms race, is one of these enormous facilities packed with the latest Nvidia chips. We are talking about the cutting edge of compute here, right?
Precisely right. The deal specifically gives Reflection access to Nvidia's GB300 chips inside Colossus 2, which are about as state-of-the-art as anything you can physically get your hands on in 2026.
So let me make sure I understand the money, because the structure of this thing is honestly more interesting to me than the raw headline number that everybody is quoting in their coverage.
The structure is the story. Reflection will pay roughly $150 million every single month, beginning on July 1st, 2026, and if it runs all the way through 2029, it totals about $6.3 billion.
$150 million a month. Let that number breathe for a second, because that is not a rounding error. That is a serious recurring obligation landing on a relatively young company's books.
And here's the part that made my jaw drop when I read it. Reflection was last valued at around $25 billion, but it has not yet released a public, open-source, frontier-scale model to the world.
Hold on. So we have a company valued at $25 billion, committing to $150 million a month in compute, before it has actually shipped the flagship product that justifies all of that spending?
That is the Highwire Act in a nutshell, and it tells you everything about how the frontier AI economy works right now. You raise enormous money, you lock up scarce compute, and then you race to ship something worthy of it.
I want to push back gently here, because to a lot of listeners that is going to sound completely backwards, almost reckless. Why on earth would you sign a multi-billion-dollar bill before you have a finished product?
It sounds backwards until you understand that compute is the actual bottleneck. Not ideas and not talent. The chips, the power, and the data center space are the genuinely scarce resources, so you grab them whenever you possibly can.
So you're saying the constraint has flipped. It used to be that the hard part was the algorithm or the research breakthrough. And now the hard part is simply getting enough silicon and electricity to run the thing.
Exactly that flip. In this era, having a brilliant model architecture means almost nothing if you cannot secure tens of thousands of high-end chips, and those chips are spoken for years in advance by deep-pocketed buyers.
That reframing genuinely changes how I read the whole deal. It is less a vote of confidence in a product and more a defensive land grab for the one resource that money alone cannot instantly conjure.
You nailed it, and that is why this matters. Reflection is essentially saying, we will worry about shipping later, but we refuse to be the lab that got locked out of compute while our competitors quietly cornered the market.
Let's talk about the other side of this transaction, because I find it almost more fascinating. SpaceX, a company we associate with launching rockets, is now effectively acting as a landlord renting out computing power. How did that happen?
It happened because the reporting frames this as SpaceX turning Colossus into a genuine commercial computing platform, and Reflection is far from the only tenant. There are reported deals in that same orbit involving Anthropic, Google, and the coding startup Cursor.
So Colossus is becoming something like a data center for hire, where some of the biggest names in artificial intelligence are lining up to rent capacity from a company that, until recently, was famous mostly for reusable boosters.
And when you step back, it makes a strange kind of sense. What does a rocket company already own in abundance? Land, power infrastructure, capital, and the engineering muscle to build enormous, complicated physical facilities at real scale.
That is a genuinely clever point, because the hardest part of standing up one of these mega data centers is not the software. It is the boring physical world stuff, the energy contracts, the land, and the construction.
Right. And those are exactly the assets that are nearly impossible to replicate quickly. You cannot wish a power substation into existence, and you cannot conjure up a permitted, built-out facility overnight. no matter how much funding you have raised.
So compute really is becoming the new oil in a very literal sense. The companies that control the wells, meaning the power and the chips and the land, get to charge rent to everybody else who needs to drill.
That is a perfect analogy, and it explains why so many players want to own the physical layer rather than just rent it. Owning the wells is durable, while renting leaves you exposed to whoever controls the supply.
Now, I noticed something curious in the market reaction, and I want you to help me make sense of it. Because on the surface, it seems to contradict everything we just said about how valuable this deal is.
You are talking about the stock, and yes, this is the counterintuitive twist. On the news of this multi-billion-dollar revenue deal, the publicly traded SpaceX shares were reportedly on track for their worst day since the NASDAQ debut.
That is bizarre to me. The company just announced billions of dollars in future revenue, and investors responded by selling the stock down something like 10%. Walk me through what could possibly be driving that reaction.
There are a few plausible explanations, and they are all instructive. One worry is concentration, because a huge new revenue line that depends on a single AI customer with no shipped product carries real counterparty risk for shareholders.
So the very thing that makes the deal exciting, the sheer size, is also what makes some investors nervous. Because they are now wondering whether Reflection can actually keep paying that $150 million monthly bill.
Exactly. And that nervousness is sharpened by the contract's exit terms. After an initial 3-month period, either party can walk away with just 90 days' notice, so that headline $6.3 billion figure is not actually guaranteed.
That is such an important detail, and I am glad you flagged it, because everyone quotes the $6.3 billion number as if it is locked in, when really it is more like a hopeful ceiling than a floor.
It is absolutely a ceiling, not a promise. If Reflection stumbles, or if the broader AI funding climate cools off, that contract could be unwound relatively quickly, and the actual revenue could land far below the splashy headline figure.
Let's pivot to something you mentioned earlier that I do not want to gloss over, because it adds a whole geopolitical dimension to a story that already has plenty going on. Tell me about the government connections here.
This is the thread that elevates the whole thing from business story to something with national stakes. Reflection has been building ties with government and national security customers, including work with the Department of Energy's Genesis mission.
The Department of Energy's Genesis mission. For listeners who have not heard that name, that signals this is not just another consumer chatbot play. This is a company positioning itself squarely inside the American strategic technology conversation.
That is the raid, and it connects to Reflection's core pitch, which is American-built open source models, emphasizing control, transparency, and the ability for customers to actually run and inspect the models themselves rather than trusting a closed black box.
I want to dig into that word open source for a moment, because at the frontier it gets used loosely. And I think a lot of people picture something more idealistic than what these labs actually deliver in practice.
You are right to be skeptical, because frontier open source is a spectrum, not a binary. It can mean truly downloadable weights anyone can use, or it can mean something far more restricted with licenses and conditions attached to access.
And the cynic in me wonders whether transparency is a genuine technical differentiator, or mostly a marketing position designed to appeal to governments and enterprises who are understandably uncomfortable handing their sensitive data to a fully closed foreign vendor.
Honestly, it is probably both at once, and that is what makes it effective. For a defense or energy customer, being able to inspect and self-host a model is not idealism. It is a hard procurement and security requirement.
That makes a lot of sense, and it reframes Reflection's entire compute spending spree. They are not just chasing consumers, they are trying to become the trusted American open alternative for institutions that cannot or will not use a closed model.
And that ambition is exactly why they are willing to sign a $150 million monthly check before shipping. If you want to be the strategic open option, you have to demonstrate you can actually train at frontier scale.
There's one more dynamic I keep turning over in my head, which is the almost circular nature of all this money. Investors fund the lab pays the compute provider, and the provider buys more chips with it.
You are putting your finger on something a lot of analysts are quietly worried about, because so much of this AI economy is capital flowing in a loop between a handful of deeply interconnected, overlapping companies and their backers.
And when the players are this entangled, with Musk-linked entities on one side and richly funded labs on the other, it raises real questions about concentration and whether the whole structure is as independent as it looks.
It absolutely does, and concentration risk is the phrase I would underline twice here. When the same small group controls the chips, the power, the capital, and increasingly the models, that is a remarkably narrow base for an entire industry.
Let's also spare a thought for everyone who is not in that inner circle. Because for every reflection that locks up billions in compute, there must be smaller labs and researchers who simply cannot get in the door at all.
That is the quiet casualty of these mega deals, and it troubles me. When the best chips get reserved years out by the richest players, the academic labs and scrappy startups are left fighting over whatever scraps of capacity remain.
So the same forces that make this deal a remarkable business story also point toward a future where serious frontier AI work becomes the exclusive playground of a small number of extraordinarily well-capitalized organizations and nobody else.
Exactly, and that is the tension worth holding on to. This deal is simultaneously a sign of incredible momentum and a warning about just how few hands are steering the most powerful technology that humanity has ever attempted to build.
So when we zoom all the way out, what is the single biggest takeaway you want listeners to carry away from this reflection and SpaceX story as they think about where the whole industry is heading next?
My big takeaway is that the center of gravity in AI has shifted from clever software to physical infrastructure and capital, and whoever controls power, land, and chips increasingly controls the future of the entire field.
And I would add that this deal is a preview of a world where the lines between industries blur completely, where a rocket company is an AI landlord and a model lab is a major national security contractor.
That blurring is the real headline, and I think we will look back on 2026 as the year compute stopped being a back office cost and became the central strategic asset that everyone was fighting to control.
Well, this has been a genuinely fascinating one to unpack, and I suspect we will be revisiting the consequences of these compute megadeals many more times as the rest of the year unfolds around us.
I have no doubt about that, because every one of these contracts reshapes the competitive map. And the next surprising tenant on a data center like Colossus could rewrite the story all over again very soon.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.